poor people here who have dated rich people. What did you learn? How was the contrast? Story 1. She was a full-time professional fine artist, oil painter. Dad was a pioneer in green energy. Whole family is loaded as a result. She was able to focus on school, earn her MFA, travel the world on residencies, etc. She was wonderful and goes to show you that when you have a well-adjusted upbringing, support, and the money to provide resources, you can be who you were born to be. Absolutely could not relate to the socioeconomic struggles of the people she dated, though. Story 2. I grew up very blue-collar poor. The men I knew fixed cars, re-roofed their own houses, knew plumbing and electrical stuff, etc. My husband grew up very wealthy. His family had a massive house, a pool, a vacation home in Spain, and maids. Honestly, the contrast was stark. The first thing he did after we moved in together was put liquid dish soap in the dishwasher. He didn't know anything. He didn't know the vacuum needed to be emptied. It could have been a deal breaker, but he fully embraced his ignorance and learned. It was a whole new world and he loved it. One of my favorite memories is of putting up our first Christmas tree. He'd never been part of that and got so much joy from it. Story 3. Had a girlfriend in high school. We dated until sophomore year of college. What baffled me wasn't her disregard for the cost of things, but the fact that she couldn't understand why I couldn't just pick up and take her out for nice dinners or buy her $400 Louis Vuitton sneakers she wanted for Christmas, especially since she was willing to buy me $250 Jordans. I declined. She was such a sweet girl but had no concept of other people coming from poor families. No idea how I had no money despite being 16, 17 and not having a job. When I got my first minimum wage job at 18, I spent pretty much everything I had on her for several years. She also took me out and bought me nice gifts, but she never had a job. She had a $300 week allowance from her dad, but would ask him for money whenever she wanted anything, so she wouldn't spend her own allowance on anything. She had like $9K in her bank account by the time we were 18, and I had $200 to my name most of the time, LOL. Very nice girl, gorgeous. She was very good to me, but I eventually lost interest because of reasons that had nothing to do with money. Story 4. The family was an entity in itself and had rules. Relationships are everything. The family itself is a thing. The club, the parties, the vacations, the homes, the cars, the business. It's all about the family, the patriarch, the traditions, the schools, the business partners, and the neighborhood and the club. It's not a bad thing, it's just different. I was raised to be independent and get the out of my parents' house. They stick together like glue. Everyone has a role to play, but they have security and they belong. I never belonged anywhere. I was raised by people who had kids because that's what you were supposed to do. And then I got the out of their house when I turned 18, and that was that. Story 5. My ex was a poor sod, but his family I got to know was buttered. I also got to know he was basically leeching off them, which led to the strange arrangement of him not earning nearly as much money as he expected of anyone else like me. He would constantly talk about the way I lived an ordinary life. My furniture was, my clothes were cheap, and my gifts were never good enough. How did I not buy my food at the gourmet store anyway? According to him, I didn't know how to cook either, because how could you make real Italian pasta without the real Italian recipe? Recipes that his parents brought from all of their luxury travels all over the world, and none that came from him. His cooking was made even more hilarious by the fact this dude couldn't cook even a simple dish on his own. But his brother was a chef, so whenever he needed instructions, which was always, he would call his brother. I left him soon because his attitude was utterly insufferable. What I learned is that it's okay if you're rich. You're still dateable as long as you're not an asshat. Story 6. I wouldn't say I was poor, more average, but the two wealthy women I dated were both quite spoiled. They expected to get their way, and what was interesting for me was that they both expected their money to open doors and solve problems, rather than using courtesy or charm. My ex-best friend was the same. What was very notable for her especially was the smallest thing was a crisis. People who have never dealt with true pain or loss because they've always been shielded from it are upset by small things. Story 7. That in majority of the cases, all is fine until you met the family and friends. You sit there like an unable to relate to anything what they say, and once you think some familiar topic appears, it ends up with a discussion about 10K baby strollers, wines, or childhood memories about skiing in Switzerland, or taking a trip to a seaside with their first Porsche. Their friends' interests were mostly things outside my tax brackets. Couldn't even relate to typical girly discussions about makeup and clothing because their talks were about picking Birkin over Chanel, not about cute Zara top. Problem starts also when comes to buying a gift because there is no way you can match the amount of what they want to buy you, and any kind of decision involving finances when you want to go 50-50ths. But the holiday which your partner picked are your 5 salaries. A lot of people make it work. I tried 2 times and each time I felt out of place very quickly. Story 8. I grew up middle class and sometimes really struggled depending on my dad's job status. My wife grew up quite wealthy. Think maids, nanny, vacations all over the world, private school. Our biggest hurdle during the first couple years of dating was lifestyle issues. Just seeing how much she'd spend without even worrying about the price or budgeting, not thinking twice about a purchase or when grocery shopping. It was the small things I was more amazed at and found tacky more anything. If you asked her, she would say I have far more financial literacy than her. She's a hard worker and works long hours, but still has that safety net. We are happily married, but navigating status, class, was a huge hurdle in the early stages of our relationship and sometimes still creeps in. Even now, during the holidays, it's noticeably different between how my family does things versus hers. My siblings have great jobs, homes, etc., but still does not compare to how elaborate and expensive my wife's family does things. Story 9. When I was 26, I was making around $20K as a server. I dated a 32-year-old corporate attorney who was making $300K. I think the biggest thing it showed me is that I was capable of more in my life. For a long time, I thought I was just going to be a server because that's all I could do. She showed me to want more and to strive for more. I'll always be thankful to her for that because she changed the trajectory of my life. I went back to school and have a different career now. She pushed me to want something different, and it's something I didn't know was possible until I met her. Story 10, I guess mine is a success story. My mom was a single mom and cleaned hotels for a living. We were well below the poverty line. I got free lunch at school, started working at 14, and first person in my family to do college. That whole deal. I met my now husband right before COVID hit. I was doing great financially by my standards, low middle class salary, still renting a house with a mother-in-law type guest apartment that I shared with a friend, paying off my student debt slowly. I could go out to eat twice a month and afford to have a dog, so I pretty much felt like I made it. He is a very specialized type of doctor. We met on a dating app. He doesn't come from money, so I think that helped us to connect initially. Plus, he's worked very hard and he actually works for his money, rather than just having it. We live pretty modestly compared to his friends in the same general field, but we travel a lot. I still work, but much less. The biggest thing to me is that I didn't realize the constant anxiety and stress that being poor, or even being kind of okay but still struggling, creates. The always doing math, always checking my bank, stacking bills just right to avoid overdraft, waiting for payday. I don't think about those things anymore, and that's pretty surreal. Also, the thing that upsets me the most consistently is how much extra stuff and free you're given when you don't need it. We get our hotel rooms or plane seats upgraded, and extra food or drinks at dinners. That would have made my year if it happened to me when I really needed it. It honestly makes me upset and angry at times, and my husband doesn't see why. Editing to add one more thing on my mind a lot lately, kids. I'm pregnant, which is great, but I'm so worried about our kids being out of touch or spoiled. I know there's a lot of variables to that, but the idea of doing private schools or brand new first cars, it gives me the ick. Story 11. I learned that soup could be homemade and didn't just come in tins. In fact, I discovered a whole bunch of foods I'd never previously encountered, such as dates. In general, I realized that outwardly perfect families with loads of money and material security could still be miserable and dysfunctional. A comfort maybe, and an eye-opener. Edit. Some context for all the folks trying to educate me on soup. When I learned the fact above, I was 15. I was raised by a single working mom who didn't cook much, and to that point hadn't made soup. She wasn't lazy or ignorant. Story 12. I've done it twice, once in undergrad and once in vet school. The girl in undergrad kind of felt like she was dating me for the experience. Like she'd never been to an Aldi before and kind of went overboard on the Aldi fines, and was very confused that I went to both Aldi and Meijers for my groceries. Her dad absolutely hated me because I wanted to be a vet instead of a real doctor like him. She always asked like weird questions about growing up not rich, and I'm pretty sure she thought my childhood was like the movie 8 Mile. I grew up in a suburb of Detroit, but very much not 8 Mile. Otherwise, she was pretty chill about most things. She usually paid for stuff if we went on expensive dates, but she also seemed to genuinely enjoy the cheap dates I managed to find, like I found a lot of nice trips with my student discounts. The girl in vet school was determined to pretty woman me, or I guess more like the episode of The Simpsons where Lisa tries to make Willie a gentleman. Like she insisted I come to Whole Foods with her. She had a polo pony, and she wanted me to learn about polo and ride horses and stuff. BTW, horses really don't like me. She'd done a lot of study abroad and seemed almost offended I'd gotten into the program without it. She would buy like fine wines and cheese and then want to see how I reacted to them and seemed surprised when I knew stuff from the museum. It was nice at first to get a bit spoiled, but it got weird. She also had no concept of what was expensive for the rest of us, so she would always want to do really fancy nights out at high-end clubs after exams, and the rest of us would be like, it's $2 beer night at the campus bar, so we're going there. Story 13. I've dated a couple I grew up adjacent to wealth, and first off, they were lovely people, caring and thoughtful, but the truth is they were simply unable to understand poor. What I realized was that the struggle to afford things binds people together, and working towards a common goal, say a trip or a more expensive item, is a reward that couples can share together. We did it, they'll say. I also realized just how much the subject of money comes up in any relationship, and if you aren't in the same boat financially, it's alienating for both of you. Hard to get past that in most situations. Story 14. I have always dated guys who had their education paid for by their parents. Either mom and dad paid 100% of their education and rent in full, or didn't help pay rent, but would send some money over every once in a while and would be there for emergencies. I just can't relate because my parents, despite doing well financially, would even grumble if I asked for 100 euros cash for birthday so I could buy a second-hand washing machine. They would say something like, "Don't expect a birthday gift next year." I never expected them to pay for my education. I never expected them to pay my rent, utilities, or groceries or anything. I paid for everything myself, which is absolutely fine. But sometimes I'll remember something and tell my partner and he'll be like, WTF. Like the time I had 0.15 cents and bought spaghetti without meat, veg, or sauce and ate it like that because I was so hungry. And his immediate answer is, "Didn't your parents help pay for rent and groceries and education?" And I'm like, no. Story 15. Always have a way out. People with money know it's a tool to control people and will use it. If you find you're staying because you've been trapped without ability to financially survive, well, no bueno. When we would vacation, I would get threatened abandonment in another place that I couldn't leave, so I'd have to comply. Dinner on him and we argued at the restaurant. Give in or he will pay only his portion. It was all control. Now I let people treat me, but always am able to cover my flight back. Don't pay for me to control me. And I knew it'd get worse with kids and being married. You're at a rich person's whim if you put total trust in them for care. Story 16. Partner born to wealthy family. Generational subdued wealth. International trips a few times a year, live in housekeeper, best schools, NOLs, sports and art exposure. Good person, gave back with volunteering and donations. Contrast, could not relate to debt, fears of homelessness, or money anxiety. Biggest contrast, never afraid to try new things or make mistake. Took a job that didn't work out, that's okay. Family will keep you afloat until you find something else. Broke a leg overseas because you took a skiing risk in Italy, no worries. We'll charter something or find a way to get you out. I don't have that kind of freedom. Story 17. I'm not poor, but came from a working-class AVG family, and I do very well for myself now. Around 30, I dated a girl who I knew was rich when she told me to pick her up at her parents', and when I Googled the address, the place had a gate to get in. She worked an honest teacher job and was very humble, kind, and grounded. I did notice small things like for her bidet, she said she was going to buy herself $1,200 sandals. Ain't no teacher buying those. Things fizzled out after a few dates, but I always wonder how, if people could date with such disparity in family socioeconomic classes. Found out after her family is worth like half a billy. Story 18. She had a net worth of 40 million or so and didn't earn it due to her family being very wealthy. She was so disconnected with the real world and was a true narcissist. Everything had to be her way, including aspects of my personality. It was constant nagging about aspects of me she didn't like and wanted me to change. She was very manipulative, and the moment I started to push back, she ended it. Wild ride. Story 19. I grew up upper middle class, two lefty help people out lawyers for parents, so not poor by any means. But I was engaged to a woman whose father was a partner at one of the U.S. top 5 law firms. His retirement income is more than my parents' combined working incomes. I learned that they used money to attempt to solve all of their problems in life, especially interpersonal ones. I learned that even at that level of wealth, Americans still teach their kids we're poor. I learned that the social pressures that all of those people live with are nuts, and as a result, they and their social circles are infinitely more competitive and judgmental of each other than anyone I grew up around. She was spoiled AF, having grown up watching her mom scream at her dad anytime she was upset, and then seeing her dad spending money on her mom to placate her. She expected that in our relationship, and I as a broke grad student obviously could not provide that, but nor would I have wanted to even if I could have. Story 20. My wife, before we met, went out with a rich guy on a first date. Instead of inviting her to his house, he invited her to a lavish vacation. She was like, I have work on Monday, and considered him a creep. Another ex of my wife sold a company to Microsoft and got a lot of money. He rolled up with a Jaguar thinking he would impress her. Now she knows nothing about cars, so she said something like, "You got a new Hyundai?" And it wasn't a joke. She literally thought he bought a Hyundai. So whenever I see a Jaguar with my wife, we point and say, "Look, it's a Hyundai." And an ex of mine lives in Canada now and went out on a date with an NHL hockey player, which I guess is the equivalent of having dating Jesus or something over there. Anyway, she was a little happy but annoyed that she appeared in a newspaper, back when newspapers were a thing. Story 21. Growing up where I'm from, it's rare for me to think of any girls that weren't wealthy. Our family, on the other hand, was lower middle class. One girl I've dated who also had the worst mental health issues was the most well-off in her family. Her dad paid for a brand new car in cash, Chevy Equinox, paid for her college in full, and paid her rent in full, and covered all living expenses when I met her. I, on the other hand, have paid myself for everything I owned and the education I have. She didn't understand or couldn't estimate the cost of anything. I can remember when I asked her, "How much do you think I make a week?" and she said $20,000. I'm 23 BTW, I was 21 then. I just felt this massive sense of not being enough for her. I hope every day I might be able to find a girl who is just happy to be with me and doesn't care about what I have. Until then, I'll feel lonely. Story 22. My wife's parents were loaded. She went to a posh private school, etc. I learned lots about how many resources fancy schools have compared to the state ones. The most hilarious I remember was that for my final design and technology project, I built a clock, which was basically some bits of MDF with a couple of quid clock mechanism attached. My wife built a hovercraft, like one she could race around a field. The biggest impact on her now is that she struggles a bit with budgeting and saving, because it wasn't really a thing while she was growing up. If wanted something, she could just have it. Story 23. Can I do the opposite? I'm relatively well off and dated people that grew up poor. The biggest takeaway that's really unfortunate is she conflated love with finances. She would perpetually try to show people she loved them by spending money on them. She would miss rent payments because she was trying to help friends who were behind on their rent payments. She would buy people gifts she couldn't afford. She would get upset with me for not spending as much as her on gifts to her because even I couldn't realistically justify the amount she would spend. It was really sad, honestly. She tried so hard to help everyone around her and was convinced that was the way to show love. But ultimately, it was destroying her life and made it so she would permanently stay poor, taking on credit card debt because I love you. It was self-destructive. Story 24. The guys I dated with money tended to come in different shapes and sizes. There were humble ones who got wealthy after growing up with a normal childhood. The ones who were born into money tended to be entitled, low in empathy, possessive, and unable to take no for an answer. I wouldn't want to date a born rich guy again, much less be in a long-term relationship with one. Story 25. We are middle class. I dated generational wealthy dude in past. Let's say I bankrolled us first 2 years, dating, going out, eating, grocery, gifts for him and gadgets. Everything was done by my salary that was 100 times lower than him. I didn't want to be called as gold digger because that's what people around him assumed. I was keeping us entertained and floated. He appreciated me in start, but I realized massive advantage he had over me always looming over my head. Like he is doing me a favor, or I'm a pity case, etc. Everything became extremely toxic. He started to use my financial independence against me. He wouldn't pay for anything, and if I asked for his share, I'm after his money, or I'm proving people right by not paying for him. It was bad relationship. We broke up after a lot of drama, and when I left, it was because I was after his money, and when he didn't provide, I dumped him, according to his friends. Story 26. I dated a girl. She was a nurse, and her dad was an HP CTO. She never had any problems with money because new car, dad, new TV, or washing machine, dad. She didn't understand being a nurse usually wouldn't grant her all that. Vacations in Aspen or Switzerland and whatnot. When I told her I most certainly can't give her that life, she dumped me. Story 27. She's an heir to a gigantic publicly traded company. She never makes big purchases with her own money. Think houses, new cars, work vehicles for her ranch, massive renovation projects, etc. She borrows money against her portfolio for everything. The interest rate she pays on the loan is significantly less than the returns on her stocks. She either eventually pays off the loan with her income from her job, or if it's an appreciating asset, she either sells the asset for a huge and usually tax-free profit, then pays the loan off, or borrows against the asset since it's technically paid in full to buy more assets. Rinse and repeat forever. Story 28. I'm not poor. I do pretty well, but I dated the daughter of a billionaire. Old money. We had some big picture incompatibilities that wasn't anybody's fault, which meant we couldn't go very far, but she was a great person. One of the most honest, honorable, kindest, not just people I've dated, but people I've met. She was surprisingly normal. She wasn't flashy, didn't go for a lot of high-ticket price items, paid attention to what things costed, and didn't do hugely extravagant things, made good investments, and actively monitored them. She had a very good head on her shoulders. So I guess what I learned is that they're just people like the rest of us. Story 29, gifts all the time. Like, hey, it's Wednesday, here's a box of chocolates. Here's a $300 watch for no reason. Also, we were never really dating. I was just allowed to be there for a few years. I wasn't allowed to talk or speak directly to the parents she lived around, so I would just shut down like some robot, and her parents wouldn't even notice me, and that was perfectly acceptable. I was forbidden to ever leave her side of the estate, multi-house complex. She resided in a 2-story building with her bedroom decked out with elaborate stuffed animals on the bed and velvet on almost everything, the kitchen/patio/garden area, with stained glass windows, 2-car garage. She never drove /3 bathrooms and a few other rooms we never went into because she was afraid of going into them. She was super superstitious and would say she believed in ghosts and had OCD. She was a crazy town and I was young. I'm relieved she broke up with me over 20 years ago. She was super vicious when she was mad, often, and would break things, expensive things, and throw tantrums. Things could only have ended badly if young me had stuck it out. A few years later, her parents sent me an invitation in the mail to an expensive golf party/wedding/cruise/sorry. I truly don't think her parents even know I existed ever, so it was her trying to make me feel sad. Lol. Anyway, not even a year later after that, I learned she murdered her husband while he slept. He dated her before and then married her after me, BTW. Equal sign, so she lives in prison now for murder. P.S. She was gifted by her parents a small, expensive dog on one of her birthdays while we were dating. I had to watch her mistreat that dog. She would force dress it up in silly clothes or expensive purses, and if that dog ever did anything wrong, she would pick it up and throw it, sometimes against other things. I am still disturbed and shocked by seeing her do that to a small, defenseless animal to this day. Story 30. My ex wasn't crazy rich, but her family was well beyond comfortable. We graduated college together, and she went about 2 years just doing nothing because, well, she could. She could have gone a lot longer, but refrained because her dad was already starting to get testy. She was very down to earth and practical. The only real noticeable thing was her not working and still buying everything that she wanted. Again, it wasn't wild, she wasn't crazy with it, but the things she really wanted, she got with no delay. We wanted to move into a pretty nice apartment complex that our friends lived in. While we were meeting with the super the first time, she was fixing to reject us because I was the only one with a job, and it didn't pay that much. We told her we both had savings and could realistically stay for several years even in the worst-case scenario, but that didn't budge her until my ex pulled her bank statement out of her purse and handed it to the lady. The literal next thing out of her mouth was, "When were you looking to move in?" Story 31. I dated an adopted girl whose father was a wealthy partner in an industrial electrical company. He was a millionaire, easily in the tens of millions, but a very, very modest and good man, and very frugal. They had a modest home and lived modestly. I only found out about his wealth from eavesdropping on a phone conversation where he was planning to set up the electrical system for a building. This building ended up being a nearly billion-dollar skyscraper in the works. Because he came from poverty, he knew the value of money. Even though he'd give his daughter pretty much anything she wanted, though she never struck me as spoiled, he would hesitate when he bought something expensive for himself. Unless it was work-related, in which case money was no object, he'd just write off the expense. Story 32. It's easy to hate on rich people, and deserve to an extent, but I want to point out that there are a lot of people, both rich and poor, who haven't extracted any meaning from their life experiences. Bad things can happen to you, and you take the wrong lesson away from that makes dating a misery for the next in line. My experiences have taught me that wealth can definitely be a factor, but is rarely the main factor in a relationship not working out. There are lots of people who just aren't good people, regardless of wealth status, or conversely are amazing human beings. But yeah, no one is perfect. Money or not, no matter how many times you swipe on an app. I think one problem is, it's expected by many, even subconsciously, that rich people will be smarter than poor people, because we bend the knee to wealth in the United States. We worship money, so it's disappointing if someone doesn't live up to the higher expectations. Story 33. Dated a very rich girl who had even richer friends. They really had no life skills because everything that was even slightly labor-intensive was done by her staff. She didn't know how to make eggs. She didn't know how to do laundry. She had never gone grocery shopping. She had never used a vacuum. She didn't know how to do the dishes, etc. She was completely blown away when she would visit my house and see the sheer amount of labor that went into maintaining a family household. Groceries, cleaning, cooking, laundry, walking dogs, taking the bus, etc. I did appreciate that she was very unabashedly aware that she was pampered and sheltered. At no point did she try to downplay it or act like she was something she wasn't, but I don't think she truly felt bad about it until she visited my house. Story 34. I'm about to get married to one. For reference, her parents just spent $400,000 cash renovating their porch. My parents live in a second-hand mobile home. There is a huge difference. First of all, my future in-laws are well known in their community for being kind, charitable, and generous, and my fiancé is the same way. They are level-headed. When we first started dating, she asked me what I wanted for Christmas. I said some new clothes would be nice, since mine had holes in them and were old. She said, "Well, I'm going to buy those for you anyways." That's not a gift. I mean a real gift. She spent thousands giving me new clothes in the first 6 months. Some expensive, some just regular everyday stuff from Old Navy. But she literally bought me an entirely new wardrobe, then gave me a small $500 gift for Christmas, and her parents bought me an $800 gift. Not to mention the fact that she gave me a pair of Beats and a practically new iPhone because she didn't use them anyway. This was obviously mind-blowing to me. I bought her a $150 gift, but she was thrilled with it because it was thoughtful. A nice lighted jewelry cabinet instead of her keeping all her jewelry in various small wooden boxes all unorganized. I will say that for our wedding, she about had a meltdown when she found out our budget was only $50,000, not including the welcome party, the wedding planner, or the honeymoon, which is probably an additional $15K. It only lasted for 1 day before she accepted it and moved on, leaving any animosity behind, which I was really proud of her for. Overall, her or her family never judged me or mine, probably because they haven't always had money. The biggest difference I noticed is that her family bargains for everything. They do trade deals with other companies, call in favors, negotiate everything, wait until stuff is on sale, buy quality, buy it for life stuff, etc. Probably what made her dad such a successful businessman and lets them stay rich. Story 35. We were both 20, and although she wasn't rich on her own, her family certainly was. We had been together for quite some time before I went and actually visited their home. It was massive, and they had so many nice things that caught me off guard. To be honest, it was one of the things that semi-ruined our relationship. I'd hear them complain about money and things they couldn't get, and then they'd say, "I'm just going to ask my dad." Meanwhile, I was struggling to pay rent while doing manual labor for 12 hours a day. I don't know if it was just me, but I wish there would have been some sort of warning about their status. Showing up to their house blind like that was a little too much. Story 36. I dated a girl who came from a very wealthy family, grew up on Chicago's North Shore, but then her parents divorced, mom got addicted to drugs and squandered all the money. Her worldview was warped, and she pissed me off a lot. She would talk a lot about you people, or people like you, aka the lower middle class, as if she didn't live in some guy's basement for $600/month and have an overdrawn bank account. Truly the worst of both worlds. Story 37. Two totally different experiences. The first was, wow, so out of touch. They despised growing up with money, so for the entirety of our relationship, they basically played poor with me, sleeping in my car, doing tie jobs. But it was never real because every time they ran out of money, their parents would just give them more. They still live that way to this day. My current partner is a bit different. She doesn't resent the money and actually uses it to keep us afloat. It's nice not having to worry as much about how I'll make my bills by myself. I have my own expenses she wants to help with, but I want a semblance of independence. Her family's a lot kinder too. Story 38. I had a pretty rich girlfriend, and honestly, she was actually very kind-hearted and caring, and also normal. She didn't even treat money like anything that is special, in a good way. But at the time, my life was falling apart, and instead of accepting her help, I just eliminated everyone from my life, and that was a huge mistake. She wasn't even forcing me to do anything. She just was there and ready to help in any way I needed, but I hope that whoever she's dating now is a great guy, because she really deserves one. Story 39. I was in my 20s saving up for college when one of my good friends set me up with someone. We ended up dating for almost a year. She was ridiculous levels of rich. I'm not sure how much, but we visited her family twice, and each house, yep, different ones, was these movie-type massive mansions with like 10 bedrooms, butlers, security gates, exotic cars, bowling rooms, the works. Her father was some oil mogul and had his marriage arranged by his parents. Her mother is Indian, and if I recall, her parents had some ties to some Indian state council of ministers. The contrast was pretty intense. Our schedules were just widely different. At the time, I worked 2 jobs, also tried to prep for school studying up, bills to pay, etc. She didn't work and wanted to spend a lot of time together, but she would then get frustrated with me having to work. She would constantly wonder why I was doing this, suggested I don't need to work or go to school. It's like she never understood why I wanted to be educated after I told her about our family history. As one might expect, the different lifestyles were just not compatible, and after a rough Thanksgiving, I broke it off. It ended up good because after dating her, my friend that set her up confessed her feelings for me, and we ended up getting together. Been together for almost 16 years now. Story 47. This story is about the last one. I was a poor kid who got into construction and started earning a decent wage. Dated a classical musician for almost 2 years. At that time, her instrument alone was valued double what I made in a year. I met her after she just came back from Europe. She lived there for 5 years learning at some conservatory. She just didn't get it. If I made some extra money from a side job, she wanted us to go on a trip. I wanted to cook a fine meal. She wanted to go to a fine restaurant. I tried to get her to understand. I really wanted it to work because I loved her, and it was the first relationship where I felt like almost everything clicked. She broke up with me on Christmas Day a few years ago. Her reason was that she was living her passion, and she couldn't be with someone who wasn't living theirs. Never mind that she wouldn't be able to do that without her family money. I had told her my dreams before and my plans, but she deemed them unworthy. One piece of solace I got was that her father called me after the breakup. He basically told me he thought his daughter was in. Looking back, I miss her family more than her now. They are good people, and somehow they seem more down to earth than her. But after that relationship, I decided I will never date someone in the multi-millions or above tax bracket again. Need someone that knows what it's like to starve, been behind on rent, that has had some real world struggles. Story 41. I did once. I'll never do it again. I'm not poor, but I don't own anything and work online and travel around the world. My life experiences are my wealth. He is wealthy, owns nice things, probably claims to be wealthier than he really is, though, the way he was so cheap and miserly. He reminded me a few times a week how much I cost him for food, not paying rent or utilities. He invited me to live with him. He said he wanted to take care of me. I'm a really small person that doesn't cost or require much. I weigh 110 pounds and am 5'1". So my eating habits and consumption simply weren't that much. He demanded whenever he wanted, like it was my responsibility to constantly please him and be his slave, Molly maid, etc. I left after 3 months and never looked back. I despise rich people. The majority of them are greedy and self-absorbed, competitive and money-hungry. Story 42. I have dated 2 multimillionaires, and it is a wild experience, especially since I was poor AF. I was what they would call a stay-at-home girlfriend. I lived with them. I traveled with them. I kept the house, and I was a beautiful, confident, intelligent woman on their arm. I wowed their colleagues and friends with my dazzling personality. I could talk to anyone about everything. No comma, I wasn't a prostitute. The first was a young millionaire who developed some computer thing. I was 21, he was 23. It was one of the best times of my life. We traveled all the time. We had a place on the beach. I had a black card and went shopping all the time. The second was a millionaire off investments from his family. I was 24, he was 41. He took me out all the time, took me to all his work functions and out with his friends. We didn't travel as much, but went out a lot. In both cases, they were surrounded by hangers-ons. Everyone laughed at all their jokes. They always had a friend nearby, and people would drop everything at their whim. I would bet money that if they told someone around them to lick their asshole, it would have been done promptly. As their girlfriend, they expected me to be on at all times. I couldn't have a bad day around them. I learned really quickly that my role was to compliment them, as in to make them look better, not outshine them. I was to make their friends and colleagues, employees, jealous by virtue of being beautiful and conversational. My boyfriends would often accomplish this by making a show of their affection. I was basically a doll. I don't want to get into the bedroom intimate aspect, but let's just say rich people get into some kinky. But always knew that it was never a level playing field. I could never be great because they were great. It was a lot of pressure to be this perfect person. It was easy to fake for a long time. I almost married one of them. But ultimately, I needed to be more important than I was, and I left both. One after almost 3 years, one after almost 2. I was replaced almost immediately both times. Story 43. Not a poor rich contrast, but an immigrant national one. I come from an upper middle class background, and he does too. But in this new country, I worked and made life work for me. No one helped. While we were in the same career education path, his family does provide support. Our financial habits were very similar, and he was very aware of frugality. However, he never seemed to fully understand or relate to the fears I had around money. I work hourly. If I lose an hour of work, I can't pay my expenses for the month. I work full-time while studying full-time. The flexibility of academic life is needed for me to manage my energy. He did not seem to understand my anxiety and fears around this. When we broke up, his mom told me to keep going to the yoga studio that I recently found, be around other people. I couldn't help but be hurt by that, as I only was able to go to that studio for 2 weeks because they had a super cheap student trial deal for $20. I went almost every chance I had to make the most of it before my time ran out. I could never afford it with leisure money. As a family, they never seemed to be able to understand that I am alone here, and am doing all of this alone. It gives perspective. Story 44. My ex and I had kind of opposite journeys financially. I grew up upper middle class, not wealthy but certainly privileged and more than comfortable. We never wanted for anything, had almost yearly vacations, nothing extravagant but still. My dad was the main breadwinner, had a high-paying job in New York. He died right before I graduated college, and our situation changed extremely because my mom was making a fraction of what he did. She wasn't able to sustain our lifestyle alone. I almost didn't graduate and had to take out loans and start working where before I was able to just focus on being young and in school. I didn't have a lot of financial literacy because I was kind of sheltered, and my mom also was terrible with money. She was pretty much supported by my dad, so her entire paycheck was fun money, and we used to shop a lot for fun. I ended up giving her almost all my savings from inheritances and gifts over the years. On the other end, my ex grew up dirt poor. Like, farming community, all the kids share a room. Christmas was hand-knit socks poor. He went to a trade school and ended up working in a field that started with terrible pay, but slowly worked its way up to 6 figures. We got together in our mid-20s, and it was a roller coaster for a bit. I was essentially trying to self-teach how to be responsible with money and had a rough time adjusting, where he was extremely penny-pinching and protective of his building wealth. We had a lot of fights around money because of these conflicts. I do credit him for helping me get my together, although I did find his methods and comments a little harsh. Because of him, I fast-tracked my financial education. I think I would have gotten there on my own eventually, but when it comes to building wealth, the earlier the better, and I'm glad I got started on that journey in my 20s largely because of him. I entered my 30s with all my major debts paid off, student loans mainly, and I'm approaching my 40s having almost caught up on my retirement savings, emergency fund, etc., and haven't paid a dime in credit card debt in over 2 years. Story 45. Some rich guys I dated when I was younger were shocked that I did not own a car in a city with tons of reliable transportation and nowhere to actually drive when I was 18. Like having a car was so important for status even if you didn't need it. Never mind the fact I lived in a row home with a street parking dilemma. I was trashy for not having a car. As I was older, I dated a few rich or close to rich guys. They seemed less judgmental on the surface but liked the idea of being in control and thought they could keep me with their TI behavior just because they had money. Story 46. Her family owned the biggest manufacturing company in town. The name of the company was literally their last name manufacturing, so her family was fairly well known. When I started dating her, everyone told me that I knew how to pick them. Even my father was impressed that I was dating her because apparently he used to work for her dad and knew how big of a name he was. I never cared how rich she was. It was mainly family money anyway, so she only had access to it for school. She was able to attend an extremely pretentious university to study art, but halfway through her education, her father decided to stop supporting her due to him wanting her to make it on her own. She dropped out as a result and has had to figure out her living situation ever since because her father sold his company, his house, retired, and moved out of state. Her and I broke up somewhere along the way. I loved her and she was my first love, but she had trouble expressing empathy for other people, including myself. Always did what she wanted, never taking into account other people's emotions or feelings on the matter. I'd like to think that was just who she was and not her upbringing, but I do think that contributed as well, considering what her dad did to her. Story 47 was dating the best friend of a billionaire's daughter. They were both ridiculously well off. Crazy moments for me were a pound 500 plus food shop to last us approximately a week, then booking Disneyland in for us all. I went to look up prices online and book it. Well, she chuckled at me and said her travel coordinator, assistant, would sort it. And within a day or two, we had first-class flights and itinerary emailed over. I guess I felt like a kid when Santa just magics up presents. They have so much money, they just make things happen. It was a massive reality moment for me, and I make pretty good money still. Edit. In a long-term relationship with a more down-to-earth partner and mother of my children now, money doesn't make you happy. Love does.